Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Umber Studios. Welcome to another online portrait drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you 3 photographs on the screen, one for 10 minutes, one for 20 and one for 30, and it's your job to draw the image that you see. Lizet will be joining us today. She'll be doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow her advice or do your own thing. It's entirely up to you. Once it's finished, don't forget to post your photographs on Instagram and hashtag them with hashtag #RawUmberLive. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest Raw Umber portrait session. This week, I will take you through all the basics of a good portrait drawing. First, a little bit about the materials. You can use whatever you like, but I will be using some willow charcoal, a grey putty rubber, which is useful because you can shape it very precisely. If you don't have one, try cutting your white rubber into a wedge shape so you have a fine point for erasing. And finally, I have my blending tools. And I like to use a paper stump and a brush, but feel free to use whatever you fancy. Could be a finger, tissue, Q-tip, whatever you like to use. So let's get to the drawing. Now, when holding your pencil and charcoal, try to hold it very loosely in your hands and draw off your whole arm instead of just your wrist. As you can see, when I draw using a tight grip, like you would a pen for instance, the stroke on the paper is very dark, hard to erase and a little bit wobbly. Now try instead to hold it more loosely in your hands and use your whole arm or elbow to steer. And this really helps with making light marks that are relatively straight. So now I've put the top and the bottom on. Let's look at some measuring. So when I put my thumb and the tip of the pencil at both those marks, I can simply turn it to copy that same measurement. And this is called comparative measurement. I keep checking using the tip of the pencil and my thumb on both the photo and the drawing, and then I can compare that length to other areas. So now using comparative measurement, try finding the midpoint of the left line of the box. This will be the eye line. And when we take this eye line across, on the other side of the skull, that same line will be the back of the skull. With comparative measurements, you can't only find halves, you can also, for instance, find thirds. And this is really useful. For instance, if I divide that left line into 3 thirds using the comparative measurement, those thirds will be the forehead, the brow to the bottom of the nose, and then the bottom of the nose to the chin. Now keep in mind that the proportions I'm teaching here are ideal proportions and therefore slightly different on every individual, but I find it's a good starting point. So now we've done some measuring, let's have a look at some angles. For instance, we can use that vertical line, that is the left front plane, as a guideline, and then look how the angle of the nose is different and compares to that. Now I'm going to do that for the rest of the profile, so for instance the forehead, and these angles are very useful for the likeness. And I like keeping my lines straight because it means they are easy to correct. For instance, I feel the nose is a bit too long, so I'm just going to move my straight lines inward. For the mouth, look at the long angle from the base of the nose to the bottom of the chin. And again, this is a very personal angle and will do a lot for the likeness. Next, to find the ear and the start of the jaw, simply draw a cross along the box. In the middle of that box will be the start of the jawline. And again, try to keep your angles straight and check your angles compared to the vertical. Now I can use that same method to round off the top of the skull. And don't mind the hair for now, just try to get a general skull shape and then we can put the hair on top. So as you can see, dividing areas into thirds, quarters or halves can be very useful, and I do this when drawing all the time. So for instance, I'm trying to find where the neck starts, so I just check if I can divide an area into thirds or halves. In this case, I see that I can divide the whole skull into 3 thirds, and along the line of that first third, if I drop that down, I see that is where the front of the neck starts. So I'm now going to use the same method but for smaller shapes. So for instance, for the mouth, I see I can divide the bottom of the chin to the bottom of the nose into 3 thirds, with the first third being the line in between the lips, and the bottom third being the mass of the chin. So now using the same method of finding angles, I can put the mass of the chin in and the angles of the lips. So now let's have a look at the hair. So I know that the ear is located just behind that halfway mark of the jawline, and in front of that I can see the angles of the hairline. And feel free to shade this in completely, because of course the hair is a bit darker than the skin. And don't forget that the hair is sitting on top of the skull, so give it a bit of volume. And while we found that big mass of the hair, we may as well start looking for other big dark shapes. So for instance, I can see one sitting right below the jawline, another big one on the neck. And again, I try to look at angles, and then I could just shade it in. So for the last bit of time, I'm just going to find the eye socket using the same dark mass. And I'm going to do a bit of refining. And after that, I will see you in a 20-minute pose where we're going to take the same method but push it a bit further. Okay, so for the second pose, I'm going to start the same way by first measuring the top and the bottom, placing those on the page. And now because she's looking pretty much straight at us, I'm going to put down a center line. And this is the line that goes all the way from the middle of the forehead to the middle of the chin. Now using the comparative measurement method, I can first find the midline, which is the line of the corners of the eyes, and then find the 3/3, with the bottom line being the chin, the first line being the bottom of the nose, the second line being the top of the eyebrows. Now using the same comparative measurement, I can look on the picture and see that the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin is the same length as the middle of the nose to the outside of the cheekbone. So now we have the height and the width. So now let's start by breaking this down. So remember from the 10-minute pose, looking at the angles, comparing them to a vertical. So for instance now, for the side of the face, I can see the angle is going inwards. And once I have this for one side, I need to make sure it's symmetrical, so I do the same thing on the other side. For the mouth, I can divide that bottom third up into 3 little thirds, the first one being the dividing line of the lips, the second one being the start of the chin. And I can use that start of the chin to figure out where the angle break of the bottom of the jaw starts. Similarly, if I follow the nose horizontally, I see that is the place of the bottom of the earlobe. So finding these vertical and horizontal alignments can be really, really useful. So now looking at the angle of the hair, like I did before, I can start putting the big swoops and the big masses of the hair in. And then of course the same thing for the shoulders and the neck. For the neck, a very useful point is the outside edge of our skull, because I can see that's pretty much in alignment. I use that to then look at the other side of the neck. So now let's look at some proportions inside of the face. So starting with the eyes. On her, I see the eyes fitting 4 times in the total width of the face. For the brow, I know that that third line is the line that is the highest point of the brow, and then using that method of checking the angle versus the horizontal, I look at the angles of the brows. For the nose, I use a vertical measurement, so I see that the corners of the nose line up almost perfectly vertically with the corners of the eyes. So now we have all these measurements in. It can be very tempting to go straight into rendering the eyes, for instance, but I would encourage you to work from big to small shapes. So for instance, right now, the first thing I'm going to do is make the distinction between dark and light. So for instance, the light is coming from the top left, so we see a shadow being cast on the bottom of the nose going to the bottom right. Now for the eyes, we know the eyeball sits in between the marks that we made before. But if you remember from the 10-minute pose, the whole eye socket is angling inwards, and this is to protect those eyeballs. And what this means is that the whole eye socket will be darker than the area surrounding it. So I like to start by just darkening those. For the mouth, try dropping 2 vertical lines again to find the corners of the mouth, and then feel free to shade in the top lip and the bottom lip. So all the angles that are going inwards in the previous pose will be in shadow in this pose. So now I've got the shadows or the features in, I can start looking at the big turn of the head. So we know that the head is turning away, and as it turns away, it won't actually receive any light anymore, and this is what causes the shadow. Of course, in the meantime, if you're watching this and you have any questions, feel free to ask me something in the comments. So again, I'm trying to work from big to small here, so I'm just going to shade in the whole mass of the hair, because generally it's a bit darker than the tone of the skin. And to simplify it, I constantly keep thinking in absolutes, is this dark or is this light? Nothing in between. Now at this point, you might find that the shadows are a little bit scratchy, so I like to go in with a stump or a tissue or maybe a little brush and just flatten the shadows, meaning that I'm getting rid of any texture or lines inside of them. And this is a stylistic thing, so feel free to leave them or to do the same thing. Now at this point I'd like to introduce you to edges, and for those of you who've got a subscription, I've just done a short 10-minute video explaining a bit more, so feel free to check that out after this video. The main thing I want to teach you is the difference between sharp and soft shadows. So for instance, the shadow that's cast by her nose is quite dark and quite sharp, so I'm going to emphasize that with a line. On the other hand, you can see the shadow on her cheekbone. If we compare that to the sharpness of the cast shadow below the nose, we can really see that's quite blurred and quite soft. So what I like to do here is go across the shadow rather than along the shadow, which is what I did in the shadow below the nose. Again, if you're feeling like this is a bit harsh, feel free to use a blending tool to gently blend this in. And what I like to do is look for a hard edge opposite a soft edge. So for instance, the outline around her neck is quite crisp. So I'm now going to emphasize that with a line. The same thing around the chin. I try to look for one hard and one soft edge. So I see a harder one at the top of her chin and a softer one along the side of her chin. And I'm constantly trying to look for that contrast of hard versus soft. And what this will do is start making form appear. So when I blend around the lips start feeling like they're going round. So for instance, when I blend the lower lip here, you can see that starts feeling like it's becoming a rounder, softer form. And this is what gives your drawing life, and this is what makes your drawing feel real. So rather than putting in details, just playing with these edges between the shadow and the light can really enhance the realism of your drawing. And you might find that you have to go over things a few times. For instance, here, I'm thinking, should I put a little hard edge there, or should I maybe blur it out? And that's okay. You can try things out and see what works and what really makes the form pop out. So the same thing on the eye. First I'm looking for the hard edge, which I see is the bottom of her eye. And I see another hard edge along the top lid of her eye. And maybe a final one below the brow. So now I have my hard edges in. I'm going to try and find my soft edges. So for instance, from the top of her brow to the corner of her eye, I see a soft, gradated shadow edge. And at this point, feel free to start making your drawing a bit more accurate. So I still work from big to small. In this case, the biggest shape that I haven't got in yet is the iris. So I'm going to put that in first. And I find working this way prevents me from making big mistakes. So if I first have all my big shapes in, so for instance with the eye, first the placement in the head, then the placement of the eye socket, then the placement of the brow and the lids of the eye, then this allows me to make small corrections every time, which helps me place the eye a bit better. But of course, every artist works in a different way. So this is just the way I like to work. And I would say try it out, see if it works for you. And if it doesn't quite work, feel free to discard that and just use what you can and leave everything that's not useful to you. Okay, so I'm now moving on to the next eye. One thing that's important is to keep the sense of symmetry. So for instance, if I have placed the top lid in a certain area, I have to make sure that horizontally that other lid also lines up. Same thing with the irises. If one is looking far left, the other one also has to be placed the same location on the eyeball. And again, I'm looking for hard edges and soft edges. So for instance, the brow is a bit harder, the top of the lid's a bit harder, but everything else is quite blurred. Okay, so for the rest of the pose, I'm going to continue making my way down towards all the features, looking for hard edges versus soft edges. Again, feel free to ask me any questions in the comments, and I will see you in a 30-minute pose. Alright, so for the last pose, let's combine everything we've learned in a 10 and a 20-minute pose. So I'm first going to start with that same center line that I used in the last pose, which is the line going from the middle of the forehead to the middle of the chin. And note that here she is leaning on her hand, so it's not actually straight. Next, I can place the top and bottom on the page, and then find the midline, which will be the line that signifies the corners of the eyes. After that, I can start finding the free verts. And then using one of those verts to find the width of the cheekbones. Next, I'm going to find the angle, and note that now we're not comparing to a vertical line, but instead we're comparing to the center line. So we can see that compared to the center line, the cheekbones narrow down towards the chin. I can see the angle break of the jawline is situated about halfway between the bottom of the chin and the bottom of the nose. And once I've got all the lines in, I can start adding the mass of the hair on top. When doing this, try to keep a light touch, work with your whole arm, not just your wrist, and try to look for the big expression of line, rather than lots of little small lines. So now I've got that done, I can start breaking down the features. First, I'm going to look for the brows, using that same method of comparing the angles to the horizontal lines created that were perpendicular to the center line. For the mouth, bottom of the nose to bottom of the chin, I can divide that again into 3 verts, which helps me find my lips and the mass of the chin. Find the width of the eyes. Again, measure how many times it fits into the total skull, and I see that being 4 times. For the corners of the nose and the corners of the mouth, simply drop down a line following the center line and see where those corners align in relation to the eye sockets. Now I want to go straight into the shadows, looking for that big difference in light and dark shapes. And while I'm doing this, feel free to ask me any questions in the comments if you're feeling like something is not quite clear or you've got any questions. Again, for the cheekbones and the rest of the face, imagine that the face is turning away from the light, and the plane where it turns away completely from the light is the plane that turns into shadow. So we can see that very clearly on her cheekbone. Same thing on the nose. The light's coming from the top left, therefore the right side of the nose will be in shadow. If you're having lots of sketch lines, feel free to go in with your rubber and try to erase a few of those little lines that you don't need anymore. Now I'm going to start breaking down the shapes in the eye sockets, looking for that big shape of the brow and that big shape of the iris. Keep in mind that everything should be more or less symmetrical, so make sure that both brows arch in the same way and that both eyes line up horizontally. Again, not looking for an actual horizontal here, but more of a perpendicular line compared to that center line. Again, if you feel like stuff is getting a bit messy, feel free to take a Q-tip or a paper stump or a brush and just gently go over your shadows to remove any harsh lines. So now we've got the big dark and the big light shapes in. Let's start looking at those edges again. So first, looking for the hard edges in the nose, and then comparing that to the soft edges. And it really pays off here to be not very subtle at all. So if you see something that's a little bit crisp, really go for it and emphasize this with a line. And if you see something that's a little bit blurry, feel free to really go for it and soften it out into the light. The more contrast you can give between these hard and soft edges, the more your drawing will start to seem like it's coming out of the paper. If you're finding that your image feels a bit blurry, then you've probably got too many soft edges. And if you're feeling like your image is looking a bit graphic and a bit fake, that usually is a problem with having too many hard edges. So the balance really is important. I'm now going to go through all of the features, and I'm going to break down those big shapes into slightly smaller shapes. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the comments. Okay, so now I've got my shapes in, and I'm pretty happy with the lightness. I can start softening. So the whole side of the face is turning away from the light quite softly, and therefore you can see a soft edge. And I'm going to try to work that in by using lines across the form, and also by doing a bit of blending. Again, if you have soft edges everywhere, your picture will seem a bit blurry, so try to find a few nice sharp edges and emphasize those with lines along the form. So for instance, at the bottom of her chin. One thing that's important here is that you won't get it right the first try. So keep it flexible, keep your touch quite light, and feel free to just erase it if you're not completely happy with it. So for instance, right now, I'm just blurring the whole bottom of the nose and then going back in with my rubber and my charcoal and try to reinstate the shape. And you might notice me going back and forth with this quite a lot. And this is not because something has gone wrong. This is just the normal process of drawing and painting. So every try, you get a bit closer to the truth and you can get a bit more precise. At the same time, don't get too focused on the nose or the eyes or any other part. I've personally found it really helpful to jump around the drawing and focus 2 minutes on the nose, then maybe 2 minutes on the mouth, and then later come back to the nose with a fresh eye. And this stops me from losing my sense of objectivity, and it helps me see any small mistakes, because the longer you stare at a drawing, the more you get used to it and the harder it is to see the mistakes. Another thing that's really useful with this is using a little mirror or even just the reflective surface of your phone and just look at the image when it's flipped inside that mirror, and sometimes that can give you a fresh eye and you can suddenly see mistakes you didn't see for hours before. So keeping that sense of objectivity or that fresh eye is really, really useful when you're drawing a portrait like this. So I'm just going to continue doing these small shapes and these small adjustments. In the meantime, feel free to ask me anything you like in the comments. Now, as you can see, I've really emphasized the darkness and the sharp edges in the actual face and the features, and the hair is fading into the background. And this is a stylistic choice, and you could leave it like this, but in this case I felt like it would be nice to add a bit more emphasis to the hair, so I've just added a sharper edge around it. So you can see that playing with these hard and soft edges can really help with pulling focus in certain places or actually fading focus in other places. So feel free to play and try things out and see what works for your portrait. So that's the end of the post. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you feel like you've learned something. And if you use Instagram, don't forget to use the hashtag #RawUmberLife. And I hopefully will see you at the next video.
Thank you for taking part. I'd like to thank Lizet for joining us today as well. Don't forget to photograph your work, post them on Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLife. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 PM and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 PM. You can find out more details on our website, rawumberstudios.com.